I heard Graham before I saw him. The underground garage beneath the Denver hotel carried his voice across the concrete. Low and close. Nothing like the polished voice he used with clients. I had one hand on the trunk of my car, a tote bag of fabric samples cutting into my shoulder, when he breathed. Once she signs tomorrow, operating control moves before she even knows what changed. Kelsey Monroe stood near the employee entrance, listening like a woman who wanted the promise but feared the cost. My keys pressed into my palm, and for one clean second, I stopped being his fiancé and became the only person in that garage who understood what that sentence meant. Kelsey's voice came smaller than I expected. What if Brooke sees the vendor attachment and asks why my name is on it? Graham laughed under his breath, calm enough to make my skin go cold. She trusts me more than she trusts her own email. That was the part that split the night open. Not his hand at her waist, but the paperwork hiding inside the tenderness. I stayed behind the concrete pillar and let the truth keep talking. Graham said the bank would hear the transition as stability, and Kelsey asked if I would still sit at the signing table. He told her I would, because I always did what was responsible, and that word hit harder than any insult could have. Responsible was what he called me when payroll got tight, when a hotel client complained, when he needed one more revised draft signed. I looked down at the gray uniform swatches in my tote. The same hotel account Graham had suddenly insisted on managing. The swatches were real. The vendor attachment was real. And the sentence about control was real. I backed away without a sound, because whatever was happening tomorrow was no longer just about another woman. I was not going to warn him before I knew how deep his confidence went. I drove home through Denver with both hands locked on the wheel, and the city looked too normal for what I had heard. Our townhouse sat on a quiet street with porch lights, clean windows, and Graham's jacket hanging over the dining chair like he belonged there. The wedding invitations were stacked beside vendor invoices, and the calendar still held tomorrow's signing in my handwriting. I stood in the kitchen with my tote bag at my feet, staring at the word signing until it stopped looking like a plan and started looking like a trap. My phone buzzed before I had taken off my coat. Graham's message slid across the screen. Running late. Kelsey and I are cleaning up the presentation. Don't wait up. I laughed once. Not because it was funny, but because the lie had arrived wearing the same shoes as the truth I heard in that garage. I did not answer, because if he heard my voice, he would know something had shifted, and I needed him comfortable enough to leave every careless piece where it was. I called Maren Doyle from the laundry room, my back against the dryer, my voice low enough that the house felt quiet. If I refuse to sign tomorrow, what happens? I asked, and Maren went still in the way lawyers do when emotion stops being urgent. Send me the latest agreement. Every version. Every email Graham forwarded. And do not confront him tonight. When I said maybe I had misunderstood, she cut in gently. Brooke, people who misunderstand do not hear operating control and vendor attachment in the same conversation. That was enough. I packed my laptop, the company seal, the shareholder folder, and clothes that made leaving look temporary. I moved through the rooms without extra lights, passing framed photos, folded napkins, and the tie Graham had chosen for the signing. Before I left, I photographed the invoice folder, forwarded contract files to Maren, and set my ring in the ceramic bowl by the sink. Then I closed the door quietly, because I was not running from Graham. I was keeping him from knowing I had started reading. The hotel I chose was plain enough to let me disappear, tucked beside a tire shop off a Denver frontage road. I sat by the window, watching cars move through morning light while Graham's calls stacked up. By the time his texts changed from, "Where are you?" to, "I'm worried about you," I knew exactly what he was doing. The man who had whispered about control in a parking garage was trying on the voice of a frightened fiancé. Maren called before I finished my coffee, and the quiet on her end told me she had found more than ugly wording. The revised agreement does not just give him a title, she said. It lets him approve vendors, speak for the company with the bank, and sign transition documents before ownership is final. I stared at the cup, because every phrase matched something I had heard near that entrance. When I asked whether my signature would make it binding, Marin did not dress it up. Brooke, it would make it hard to argue you did not accept it. That was when embarrassment came in colder than anger. I had negotiated hotel uniform contracts, challenged late shipments, rejected inflated invoices, and still let Graham hand me revisions like dinner receipts. Marin kept her voice flat, which helped more than comfort would have. Send the older shareholder folder now, and do not call him. People close to winning usually leave better evidence than people who know they have been caught. The real crack opened a few minutes later, not in the control language, but inside the vendor attachment Graham had called routine. Marin found a company name I barely recognized, listed for inspection support on the hotel account, tied to a mailbox with Kelsey Monroe as the contact. There was no work history, no onboarding trail, no reason for an account coordinator to sit inside a vendor file. I looked at Graham's latest text. Please call me. I'm scared. And for the first time that morning, I believed one word of it. Marin found Calvin Briggs in the shareholder folder I had nearly left on the townhouse desk. His name sat on a page I remembered as old paperwork, the kind you keep because throwing it away feels careless. He still held a voting right over any major change in operating control, and the agreement did not care that Graham had never heard of him. For the first time since the garage, this stopped feeling like private shame and started looking like a structure Graham had failed to understand. I had not seen Calvin in years, not since he moved to Boulder after leaving the floor work behind. He had helped my father build our first inventory system, back when the company ran on paper tags, phone calls, and a warehouse that smelled like cardboard and steam presses. Now he taught industrial sewing at a technical school, far from hotel contracts and bank meetings, but Marin said his signature still mattered. When she reached him, he did not ask for gossip, only where to meet and what documents to bring with him. We met at a diner outside Boulder with scratched tables, strong coffee, and a bell over the door that rang every time the wind pushed somebody inside. Calvin arrived in a faded canvas jacket, his hands still rough in the way. Working hands stay rough after the work changes. I slid the revised agreement across the table, then the vendor attachment, then the page with his name printed under shareholder consent. He read each page without rushing, and when he looked up, the quiet in his face made me sit straighter. Your father put this in for a reason, Calvin said, tapping the consent clause with one finger. I swallowed hard, because the clause was only black ink on paper. But after the vendor page in Graham's text, it felt like a guardrail I had forgotten was there. Calvin looked at Kelsey Monroe's name, then back at me, and said, Don't let anyone turn trust into a signature. Brooke. He did not promise to save me, and I did not need him to. But when he said, I'll be there tomorrow, it was the first solid thing I had heard since the garage. The signing room at the hotel looked too calm for what it was carrying. White cups sat beside folders. Hotel clients leaned over pastries. And Preston Vale from the bank checked his phone, like this was another transition. Graham stood near the long table in a charcoal suit, smiling at people I had known for years as if my company already answered to him. Kelsey Monroe stood by the document stack with a tablet against her chest, not taking my chair, not making a scene, just present in a way that made the vendor attachment feel less like paperwork and more like proof. I walked in with Marin Doyle on my left and Calvin Briggs half a step behind us. Graham saw me, and the smile held 1 second too long before he crossed the room with relief painted over panic. Brooke, thank God, he murmured. I was worried sick. And I let the words hang there because every missed call had already explained that performance. I looked past him to the table and said, Before anyone signs, we need to confirm who has authority to approve this transition. The room changed without getting louder. Marin placed the revised agreement on the table, then the vendor attachment, then the shareholder consent page with Calvin's name printed where Graham clearly had not expected one. Graham kept his voice easy. This is a misunderstanding. But Preston had already leaned forward, his eyes on the clause that moved vendor approval and bank representation before ownership was final. Calvin stepped beside the table and said, "My consent is required for any operating control change, and I have not given it." Kelsey looked at Graham then, not at me, and that glance did more damage than anything I could have said. Preston closed his folder halfway and asked whether the bank had been told about the voting right or the vendor contact connected to an employee. Graham opened his mouth, but no clean answer came out, because the evidence sat in front of him in the order he had tried to hide it. I did not raise my voice, explain the garage, or call him what he deserved. I only said, "A misunderstanding does not add signing authority to a contract." And for the first time that morning, nobody looked at me like the problem. For a few seconds, nobody moved. And that was the loudest part of the morning. Kelsey stood beside the document stack with hands around her tablet, watching Graham search the table for an answer that would not make the papers worse. He gave her one sharp look, the kind that told her to stay quiet, and I saw the decision cross her face before she opened her mouth. "He told me the transition was cleared," she said, and her voice shook just enough to sound real. Graham turned toward her like she had stepped out from behind him at the worst possible time. "Kelsey, don't," he muttered. But she kept going, because the vendor attachment had her name on it, not his. He said Brooke was stepping back after the signing. That inspection support would move through my company once the bank accepted the transition. Marin did not interrupt, but she wrote the sentence down, and Preston Vale watched her pen move like it mattered more than Graham's face. That was when the room began leaving him. Preston closed his folder and said the bank would pause any approval tied to signing authority until ownership, consent, and vendor conflicts were reviewed. One hotel client pushed back his chair, polite enough to look almost sorry, and said his company could not sit inside a governance concern without speaking to legal first. Another client followed. Then a supplier gathered her folder, and the small sounds of paper and chair legs did what shouting never could. He tried to recover with a smile that had nowhere to land. "This is being blown out of proportion," he said. But Calvin's hand stayed flat on the consent page, and Marin asked Preston whether the bank wanted formal notice by close of business. Kelsey wiped under one eye and whispered, "You said she would just sign," and that sentence took the last clean corner of the room from him. I stood there with my hands still, not because I felt calm, but because the evidence had finally learned how to speak without me. By the time the door closed behind the second client, Graham was not a fiancé explaining a misunderstanding anymore. He was a business risk in a suit, left at the head of a table he had dressed for victory. Nobody escorted him out, and nobody needed to. The room had already done it. After the signing room emptied, I did not post a word about Graham. I did not call mutual friends, send screenshots, or perform pain for people who had only learned my name through his version. The fallout moved without my help because the room had watched Preston close his folder and heard Kelsey say Graham told her I would just sign. By morning, the bank requested a governance review. 2 hotel clients paused orders. And every supplier wanted one thing in writing: who had authority now? Graham lost his role, the cleanest way a man like him can lose it, through confidence withdrawing before anyone called it punishment. Marin removed him from operating access. Calvin refused consent to any transition tied to the revised agreement. And Preston would not support a bank letter with vendor conflicts in the file. Graham kept trying to frame it as a personal misunderstanding, but the contract language, Kelsey's vendor attachment, and his own missing disclosures had made that impossible. When someone asked Marin if he could remain in client development, she answered. Not while clients are asking whether he can speak for the company. Kelsey left under a separation agreement that was quiet, formal, and not clean enough to rescue her name. I did not need to make her a monster, because the mailbox vendor, the missing onboarding trail, and her own words were enough. She had believed Graham when he promised the transition was handled, but belief did not erase the fact that her name sat where it should never have been. The hotel account stopped returning her calls first, and that told me more than gossip could. Calvin went back to Boulder after signing the documents that kept control where it belonged. Marin rebuilt our approval process until no vendor attachment could slide through on Charm again. And Preston kept the banking relationship open because the company had corrected the weakness on paper. One afternoon, Marin looked over her glasses and said, "People do not lose credibility because someone tried to use them. They lose it when they pretend the paper in front of them is not real." I kept the company, but I did not keep the old version of my life. Marin helped me hire an operations manager who did not need charm to understand boundaries. And every vendor file now carried a second approval before it touched a client. The Denver restaurant accounts grew faster than the hotel contracts ever had, because people trust a business more when the person running it stops apologizing for being careful. Months later, when someone mentioned Graham at a trade breakfast, I felt nothing sharp, only distance, and that felt like winning without needing anyone to clap. I met someone quiet at a local workforce fundraiser, a man who asked about my work before he asked about my past. He did not rescue me, and I liked that most, because by then my house was peaceful. My name was steady, and my future no longer needed permission from a man who had confused my trust with weakness. One evening, I looked at the company calendar and said to myself, I did not lose my life. I learned to read it before signing. If this story sounds like a piece of yours, I hope you remember this. Peace does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it begins the moment you stop begging for an explanation and choose yourself again.